Well, welcome. My name is Mary Lewis. I'm in the history department, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies Stanley Hoffman Annual Lecture on France and the World. This series honors the legacy of Stanley Hoffman, a world-renowned political scientist who made groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of international relations and French politics. A point of relevance to this afternoon's guest is that at Harvard, Stanley founded the Social Studies program and in 1969 joined forces with Guido Goldman and others to establish the Center for European Studies, where he served as chairman until 1995. Stanley was also one of our speakers at PhD advisors, which she may say a little bit more about. She received her PhD from the government department here in 2000. I also just wanted on a personal note to say, Stanley, I've been here since 2002. I started as an assistant professor, and Stanley was the least hierarchical person that I ever encountered at Harvard. He just wanted to know what you thought, cared about the mind and ideas, and didn't care if you were an assistant professor or an emeritus or anything in between. So that's, he's definitely missed for that, and I now occupy his former office, which is nice. It's a good vibe. All right, so let me say something about our honored guest, Jennifer Pitts. She is professor of political science and in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago and chair of the Department of Political Science. She's the author of Boundaries of the International, which was published by Harvard in 2018, which explores European debates over legal relations with extra-European societies during the 18th and 19th century, and co-editor with Adam Getachew of W.E.B. Du Bois's International Thought, a collection of essays and speeches spanning the years 1900 to 1956, which is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. That's old? Yeah. It's out. Wonderful. I should have known that. Wonderful. She's also the author of A Turn to Empire, The Rise of Imperial Liberalism in Britain and France, which was published by Princeton in 2005, which is a book I assign annually to graduate students doing fields in French and imperial history. The list goes on. Co-editor of The Law of Nations and Global History, and editor and translator, and I love this, thank you for doing this, of Alexis de Tocqueville, Writings on Empire and Slavery, which was published in 2001 by Hopkins. And I use this especially with my undergraduates. It's a great example of the way in which Tocqueville's thought evolved because of France's involvement in colonies, particularly Algeria. Her research interests lie in the fields of modern political and international thought, particularly British and French thought in the 18th and 19th centuries, empire, the history of international law, and global justice. She's co-editor of the Cambridge University Press series, Ideas in Context, and at the University of Chicago, she's a member of the faculty boards for the Chicago Center for Contemporary Thought, the Human Rights Program, and the France Chicago Center. Today, Professor Pitts will speak to us on abolition on the eve of revolution, Cucuano and Condorcet. And I will just let her, I have a long thing about what that talk is about, but I'd rather just hear what it's about from her. So please, Professor Pitts, please join me in welcoming Professor Pitts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Lewis, for the very kind introduction. Thanks to Daniel Ziblatt for the invitation. Thanks very much to Susanna Sprague and Michael Barrio and the others at CES for all of you, everything you did to get me here and organize the talk and slides. And thank you to CES for all that it meant for me as a graduate student. It's a scene of very happy memories. It's my favorite, most nostalgic spot on the Harvard campus. I jogged by here this morning just to have a look at it. I'm really happy to be back inside. So it's really a great honor to be here. It's also a great honor, not to mention an intimidating one, to be invited to give the Stanley Hoffman Memorial Lecture. As Mary mentioned, I had the good fortune to have Stanley as a dissertation committee member and really to be introduced to political science as a discipline in large part by him. He introduced me to understanding what political science is. I came here as an English major from college, so I was really raw, and so he was a major source of an understanding of the discipline, what kinds of questions are worth asking, and the historical roots of the contemporary global order. All of these things were, for me, firmly shaped by Stanley, with his distinctive combination of political realism and deep humanity. Stanley was clear-eyed about hierarchies of power, but he resisted the reduction of international politics to an abstract or ahistorical conception of state interest. I also had the good fortune to take the IR field seminar with him, and I'm quite sure that it was not a standard introduction to international relations. He resolutely refused to sever the analysis of power from a normative perspective, which was wonderful for political theory students of his. And he was especially sharp about the threat posed by powerful states deluded by their sense of their own virtue, a theme in his writings on the catastrophe of the Vietnam War, among other things. I also had the privilege to TA for Modern Political Ideologies, which was a resurrection of the legendary class that Stanley had taught with Judith Sklar until her untimely death several years earlier, and that Pratap Mehta convinced him to reprise. And it was truly good luck to be in the room for those lectures. The class began with the ideological battles of the 18th century in the American and French revolutions, and he was constitutively a comparative thinker, as he said many times in his own autobiographical writings. He had a kind of distinctive bifocal vision of the world through France and the United States, two imperial nations that, as he wrote, consider themselves exceptional because, or so they claim, of the universality of their values. As a dissertation advisor, he transformed the scope of my initial dissertation project by suggesting that I take a look at Tocqueville's writings on Algeria, after which he continued to decisively shape my preoccupation with the paradoxes of imperial liberalism. I'm still gripped by questions that I began to think about in my early conversations with Stanley. For today's purposes, how thinkers of the 18th century understood the international order whose consolidation they were witnessing, with its contradictory combination of universal moral aspiration and the brutal violence of European commercial and imperial expansion and slavery. We're still living with these contradictions, not only their legacy, but their persistence in a post-colonial world, a world that's post-colonial, as Sanjay Seth has pointed out, not in the sense that it comes after the end of colonialism, but rather in the sense that the contemporary world has been decisively shaped by colonialism and can be understood only if we take that fact into account. So in honor of Stanley Hoffmann, I want to focus today on a particular moment in that history, the publication of one of the 18th century's most radical anti-slavery texts, Kwabena Ottobah Cugoano's Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evils of Slavery, and its French translation. What sorts of political interventions were these, and what do they tell us about abolitionism in the British and French empires on the eve of the French and the Haitian revolutions? The talk is based on research that I've been doing with my colleague Michael Suarez, who's professor of English and director of the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. So, in 1787, Ottobah Cugoano, born in Afante village on the coast of West Africa in present-day Ghana, and kidnapped and enslaved as a child, published Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species, humbly submitted to the inhabitants of Great Britain. The book was the first extensive abolitionist treatise in a European language by an African who had experienced slavery, and it was one of the most radical critiques of slavery published in the 18th century. Cugoano drew on the Bible and on English and natural law to call for the immediate abolition of slavery, something that almost no European abolitionists were prepared to do. He argued that the laws of so-called civilization had overthrown the order of divine law. The British routinely punished mere property theft with death, even though the Bible showed that the right response to theft was forgiveness, leniency in punishment, and an emphasis on restitution and restoration where those are possible. In contrast, European civilization treated the far greater crime of enslavement, the theft of human beings, as no crime at all. Holding the British nation as a whole guilty for the crime of slavery, he demanded that the nation devise a plan for its immediate abolition in the British Empire and undertake an international campaign to the other courts and nations of Europe. He flatly rejected the idea of indemnifying slaveholders, popular idea at the time. He entertained the idea of enslaving the enslavers as a form of punishment and restitution, and that's something I'll talk about in a bit. More broadly, he theorized the collective guilt of the citizens of the European nations that perpetrated slavery and the duties of national repentance and reparation those citizens had incurred. Duties of reparation despite slavery's irreparable evil, in the phrase that David Scott has titled his recent book. Cugoano also recognized slavery as the source of vast and unprecedented wealth for Europeans, and he warned of the apocalyptic collapse of a system constructed on such an evil. Unlike other books by African authors of the 18th century, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil of Slavery, though it is one of our few sources of information about Cugoano's life, is not primarily an autobiography. Sorry, I think I should have left it there for a minute. He begins with the story of his kidnapping in 1770 at about the age of 13 from his homeland on the Gulf of Guinea and his transportation to Grenada, where he writes he was held in dreadful captivity and horrible slavery for about 8 or 9 months, beholding the most dreadful scenes of misery and cruelty. He had been delivered from that brutal captivity in what he called a slave gang and a further year of slavery in different parts of the West Indies into a situation of servitude in England in which he was able to learn to read and write. He sought baptism, he said, so that I might not be carried away and sold again, and was baptized the year after his arrival. His arrival in England in 1772, followed by just a few months, Lord Mansfield's decision in the Somerset case, which many understood to have made slavery illegal on English soil, a view Cugoano seems to have shared. At the time of the book's writing, he was employed as a servant by the society painters Richard and Maria Cosway, for whom he worked until 1791, when he disappears from the public record, and nothing further is known of him. This etching by Richard Cosway shows Cugoano with the Cosways, and it's the only attested portrait of him, but some scholars have argued that this portrait of an unknown man may also be a portrait of Cugoano. Together with Olaudah Equiano, Cugoano was one of the founders of the abolitionist group Sons of Africa, and one of the earliest Afro-Britons to be involved in the anti-slavery struggle. On some of their letters published in newspapers, he's listed by his baptismal name, John Stewart, or as you see here, Stewart. Cugoano's book was an utterly novel intervention. Granted, a number of works on slavery by African authors had been published with the support of English philanthropists and with some public success. In 1772, James Albert Ukaso Graniosa's autobiographical narrative was published in Bath with the patronage of the Methodist philanthropist, the Countess of Huntingdon. The following year, Phyllis Wheatley published her poems on various subjects, religious and moral, also with the Countess's support. The posthumously published Letters of the late Ignatius Sancho in 1782, denouncing the horrid wickedness of the traffic, was published by subscription and widely advertised and reviewed, and it sold successfully, going into several editions quite quickly. But there's no doubt that in the Western world, Cugoano was an anti-slavery pioneer, the first formerly enslaved sub-Saharan African to publish an extensive treatise indicting the system and the civilization that had enslaved him. The English version of this remarkable text, unfortunately, seems to have had almost no uptake in Britain after its publication. Its fate was very different from the other books I've just mentioned, which were politically more moderate appeals to the humanitarian sentiments of the British public. Other than the publisher's prospectus, not a single advertisement or book notice is known to exist, and no contemporary review made its way into print. The book was not mentioned in the public press. Few copies seem to have survived. It seems the book was too radical for the taste of the main English abolitionist group, the Society for the Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which chose not to champion it or advertise it. Cugoano's call for the immediate abolition of slavery ran counter to the committee's carefully calibrated strategy of winning the middle in Parliament by restricting themselves to lobbying just about the slave trade. Given how little uptake it seems to have had in England, it's striking that Cugoano's book was quickly translated into French. It appeared the following year, 1788, the year that France's first abolitionist society, the Société des Amis des Noirs, was founded. Whoever chose to undertake this translation made a considerable cultural and material investment in it. It was printed in 2 formats, a compact duodecimo printed on ordinary paper, that's what you see here on the left, a smaller and less expensive book destined for the public, and a large octavo printed on beau papier, as the advertisement said, a larger edition for an elite audience. This is one of those. A copy was almost certainly sent to the king by those responsible for publishing the French translation. There is in the Bibliothèque Nationale a fine paper copy of the Reflections bound in red morocco and bearing in gold the royal arms of Louis XVI, which was originally housed in the Bibliothèque Royale, as we can see from many stamps documenting its provenance. You can see that there on the left. The translation I want to suggest represents an intellectual engagement with Cugoano's arguments of a sort that we don't find in 18th century England. In rendering his arguments, it sometimes even seems to underscore the text's radicalism, I'll try to argue. We can't be certain who undertook the translation and printing of the Reflections, but Michael Suarez and I want to propose that the Marquis de Condorcet was the principal agent in bringing Condorcet's powerful Jeremiad against slavery to the people of France. In doing so, we're restoring an attribution that was made in the 18th century by the book's publisher and by an anonymous inscription in one of the rare copies of the translation that has survived, which happens to be held in the special collections at the University of Chicago, but an attribution that it seems was quickly forgotten by the early 19th century. So if Condorcet was indeed the translator, his decision to publish Cugoano's treatise as part of his involvement in the newly founded Société des Amis des Noirs gives us, I think, new insights into the reception of Cugoano's thought in France and into the abolitionist politics of a key revolutionary figure. It suggests Condorcet's interest in gauging how radical arguments by a Black author might be received by the French public, and in urging public sentiment toward the abolition of slavery, as well as the slave trade, at a time when the anti-slavery cause was among Condorcet's chief commitments. The history of this translation, I want to suggest, may also tell us something important about the different trajectories of abolition in revolutionary France versus Britain. So I'm interested both in the breathtakingly novel intervention that Cugoano's book was, and in the reading, as it were, of that book that we find in the French translation. I'm also interested in the implications for our understanding of Condorcet's abolitionism and French revolutionary abolitionism more broadly that his translation of this book might have. So in my talk today, I'll first discuss a few striking features of Cugoano's argument, and I'll say something about how those arguments are registered and taken up in the French translation. I'll then briefly make the case for the attribution to Condorcet and the possible involvement of his wife, the philosophical writer and translator Sophie de Grouchy, and end with a few thoughts on some possible implications for our thinking about the two abolitionist traditions. So, Cugoano's argument. Cugoano's book, as I mentioned, begins with a brief autobiography, but it turns quickly to denunciations of racism and slavery on the basis of scripture, natural law, and English law, and a set of prescriptions for immediate abolition, a program of national repentance, and acts of partial restitution for the evils of slavery. The book is remarkable among abolitionist texts, as Sankar Muthu has argued, also a CES alumnus, for the way it situates Atlantic slavery within a larger web of the exploitative activities that interlink all the quarters of the globe. It's really a critique of European imperialism writ large, and abolition within the context of that critique of imperialism. And as Carrie Schonefeld has shown, it is distinctive for its account of the crisis-prone nature of a global financial system driven by corporate financing of national debt. Cugoano mounted a critique of racist discourse as a set of lies invented by slaveholders to justify the use of Africans as engines and beasts of burden to advance their own ease and profit. These lies include the specious pretense that Africans are inferior, that they routinely sell one another into slavery, and that the Bible gives reason to believe that God marked Africans for slavery. Cugoano thus anticipated the later arguments of thinkers including W.E.B. Du Bois that slavery was the cause of racism rather than a pre-existing racism, the justification for slavery. He argued that racial difference, far from being a sign of natural hierarchy, is an indication of human equality, a sign of God's equal love for all human beings in granting them the complexions most suited to the diverse climates in which they live. He went to considerable lengths, much pared back in the French translation, leaving just the philosophical anti-racism, considerable lengths to respond to arguments rooting racial difference in the Bible, whether in the so-called Mark of Cain or in God's curse on the descendants of Noah's son Ham and Ham's son Canaan for having violated filial piety by looking at Noah's drunken nakedness. Pages and pages of this biblical stuff. He offered a sharp, semi-satirical gloss on God's curse on Canaan and the use of the story to argue that God had used racial difference to mark Africans for slavery. He cited historical scholarship of the time that linked the Canaanites to the Phoenicians and theorized that the Phoenicians had been among the early settlers of Britain. He does this, I think, with a heavy dose of irony. For all we know, he wrote, some of the descendants of Canaan wound up in Cornwall, and from there became slaveholders in the West Indies. If there's any mark of Cain, it is not black skin, since color and complexion has nothing to do with God's curse on either Cain or Canaan. Rather, if God has marked anyone as cursed, the mark is their evil conduct itself, what he calls the stamp of their own iniquity. In this way, Cugoano showed that there are multiple ways of playing the game of biblical genealogy, and that the authority that defenders of African slavery claim to find in the Bible was unfounded. In the context of European anti-slavery movements, the two most politically radical features of Cugoano's argument, arguably, were his calls for the immediate abolition of slavery and for a comprehensive program of restitution by slaveholding nations for their complicity in an evil that must be redressed, even as it can never be fully repaired. Thus, he argued for the total abolition and a universal emancipation of slaves and the enfranchisement of all the black people employed in the culture of the colonies, taking place as it ought to do and without any hesitation or delay for a moment, even though it might have some seeming appearance of loss either to government or to individuals. I should note that while Cugoano's call for immediate abolition contrasted sharply with the gradualism of even the most radical European abolitionists, including Condorcet, his program, too, had an element of gradualism. A delay of up to 7 years from the date of an enslaved person's arrival in the New World before their emancipation. Cugoano, that is, allowed for a period in which recently captured slaves would remain in the employ of their former enslavers, working and receiving instruction in Christianity. One reason he gives is that in this time they would have sufficiently paid their owners by their labor, both for their first purpose and for the expenses attending their education. The French translation, I think, is interesting on this sensitive and tremendously consequential question of whether freed slaves owe slaveholders any compensation. And for the most part, Cugoano absolutely rejects the idea that there's any restitution due to slaveholders. But I think that the French translation here adds a bit of a moral judgment against the compensation of slaveholders that doesn't appear in the English, noting that this labor would pay the slaves ransom and even reasonably satisfy the avaricious projects formed by his master. The adjustment, as I've suggested, is fully in keeping with Cugoano's overall argument, which emphasizes the avarice of slaveholders and the total illegitimacy of any property claimed on the basis of the theft of human beings. But it's an elaboration on this particular sentence, maybe giving it a gloss that the translator thinks is warranted by the book's broader argument. Next, Cugoano's treatment of reparations is perhaps the most complex of this remarkable book. Cugoano insisted that the evil of slavery was irreparable. He wrote movingly of the need to make a just commutation for what cannot be fully restored in order to make a restoration as far as could be for the injuries already done. As Stephen Best and Saidiya Hartman have written, Cugoano's plan for reform entailed operating within the limited scope of the possible, rather than making right a wrong, restoring what has been destroyed, or giving back what has been taken. By 1787, it had already become too late for that, they say. The reparations he envisioned were, as they write, less a matter of wiping the slate clean than of embracing the limited scope of the possible in the face of the irreparable and calling attention to the incommensurability between pain and compensation. And I think that with others that this is among the most powerful features of the book. I have to say I'm not clear that this irreparable reparations point is fully registered in the French translation. And it's not here, I think, in this particular passage. So, arguing that the British public shared the guilt of the crime of slavery, Cugoano called on the nation to carry out a collective reckoning with its participation in the crime, what he called a universal reformation and national repentance, that should include national days of mourning and fasting and a national inquiry into the longstanding participation of the nation in the great and preeminent evil of slavery. In keeping with the book's exhaustive accounting of biblical and European laws of crime, punishment, and bondage, he considered the idea that unrepentant former slaveholders could justly be held in enslavement by the community, put to work at tasks for the common benefit, such as reclaiming wasteland, in order to make some restitution to the injured and to bring about their own reformation. He'd laid the groundwork for this idea earlier in the book in a passage engaging the arguments of the West Indian planter James Tobin, who ridiculed abolitionism as a wild scheme along the lines of the well-known print The World Turned Upside Down. Cugoano wrote, "If he means that the complicated banditis of pirates, thieves, robbers, oppressors, and enslavers of men are those cooks and men that would be roasted and saddled," and here you see the roasting and the saddling in the print, "it certainly would be no unpleasant sight to see them well roasted, saddled, and bridled too." He adds that Tobin can joke about such an image only because it is so unlikely that slaveholders would ever be punished with enslavement. Cugoano's own posture is one of sober disdain for Tobin's impoverished morality. While the notion of enslaving the enslavers may seem preposterous to Europeans, it's no laughing matter. Having introduced the possibility of enslavement as a punishment for slavery in this way, he returns to consider the question in his consideration of what reparation would require. And indeed, one of the ways he registers the paradox of the duty of an impossible reparation for slavery's evil, I think, is to insist that enslaving the enslavers, even if it would be legitimate according to biblical law, has no place in a Christian program of abolition and reparation. So he entertains the idea only ultimately to reject it. So he says, "Those that break the laws of civilization in any flagrant manner are the only species of men that others have a right to enslave." This would make a commutation of restitution as far as could be. There's another place of the kind of irreparability point. Therefore, if there was no other way to deliver a man from slavery but by enslaving his master, it would be lawful for him to do so if he was able, for this would be doing justice to himself and would be justice as the law requires, to chastise his master for enslaving of him so wrongly. If the enslavement of unrepentant slaveholders for the benefit of the community was legally justifiable, though, he concludes that such revenge is an inappropriate arrogation of God's power of vengeance and recompense. For all their care, the passages in Cugoano's text that consider the enslavement of unrepentant enslavers are explosive. And strikingly, it's this section that the French translation relegates to a footnote, noting that it seemed appropriate to redact a fairly long dissertation on criminal law that has nothing to do with the modern slave trade. In this way, the translator deftly brackets a contentious argument while also preserving it. The translator may even be calling attention to the passage even while purporting to present it as a section of merely technical or historical interest. It's one of the many moments in the text, I think, that attests to the profound intentionality of the translation. So having considered and dismissed that explosive proposition, Cugoano developed a more expansive and a more generative vision of the British people's collective obligation of restitution after abolition. He called on the British to lead an abolitionist effort throughout Europe, to send warships to Africa to interdict the slave trade and bring the traders to account, and to dismiss all their colonial officials and replace them with men prepared to deal with African polities with respect and reciprocity. He held out a vision of a possible future of the mutually beneficial trade between Europe and Africa that could replace the slave trade, arguing that the doors of hospitality would be opened in abundance in Africa if the Europeans made genuine alliances with African polities. But he also pointed to the history of the Sierra Leone colony, with which he had been involved, as a reason for pessimism about the willingness of the British to treat African polities with the respect they owed them. Cugoano ends his book in the tone of the Jeremiad that it is its dominant feature, warning the British that their failure to abolish slavery and undertake its reparation would result in the fury of divine vengeance. And I should say, when I was working on this material last year, I spoke to people in France about the Jeremiad, and I was told that that word does not translate into French in that way, and what it means is wailing children and not biblical exhortation. But in this context, we can call it a Jeremiad. Okay, Cugoano's English is ambiguous about what form that divine vengeance will take. The possibility of retributive violence by Africans is more hinted at than threatened. He writes, "The voice of our complaint implies a vengeance because of the great iniquity that you have done, and it ought to sound in your ears as the rolling waves around your circumambient shores rend the mountains, cleave in pieces the rocks, smite the stoutest oaks in the forest." It's very metaphorical kind of language. The French translation, with some small but significant changes to the final sentences, inserts an explicit prediction of a slave uprising. The good-naturedness of the blacks will become an indomitable fury that will overturn everything, it says, effectively. The translator here has chosen to resolve the ambiguity of Cugoano's text in the most militant direction the text allows. Far from holding Cugoano's book at arm's length, as the English Society had done, the translation appears to be embracing, even intensifying, its radicalism. So I want to turn now to the case for Condorcet as the primary agent in publishing the translation. Michael Suarez and I document the attribution to Condorcet more completely in the article that we're drafting, but I want to briefly here offer three sorts of evidence: bibliographical, biographical, and textual. So first, the bibliographical. The main evidence for Condorcet's responsibility for the translation of Cugoano's work are two: the book catalogues of the work's publisher, Jean-François Royer, which listed Condorcet more than once as the translator, though only after his death in 1794. In addition, as we saw, the copy of the work in the University of Chicago Library has Par Condorcet written in ink in 18th century script on the title page. These seem to us valuable and probably distinct forms of evidence, though of course it's possible that whoever wrote the annotation got their information from a publisher's circular, in which case they wouldn't be separate forms of evidence. Second, biographical hints in the translator's preface. So the translation contains various forms of textual intervention by the translator or translators, a preface and a long note by the translator, as well as decisions in the course of the translation itself, as I've been suggesting. So together, these give some indications of the thinking, as I've suggested, of the translator, but perhaps also their identity. So the translator tells us that he became acquainted with Cugoano's book thanks to Monsieur Piatoli, who lived for a long time in London, he says, and who knew Cugoano personally during Cugoano's time working for the Causeways as a servant. Condorcet knew and respected Scipione Piatoli, this Monsieur Piatoli, And he had reviewed the book that the translator mentions in the footnote here on the first page in identifying Piattoli. Condorcet and his wife, Sophie de Grouchy, were working during the year of 1788 with Piattoli's friend Filippo Mazzei on a text about America, which also involves a discussion of slavery, and which Grouchy and Condorcet seem to have translated together. Piattoli and Mazzei were both foreign members of the Société des Amis des Noirs, and it would make sense that Piattoli, recognizing Cugoano's book as an astonishing document, as the translator says he did, would have chosen it to send to his friend Condorcet, a renowned advocate for the abolition of the slave trade, believing that Condorcet would find a sympathetic and compelling spirit in the words of Cugoano. Third, there's suggestive textual evidence in the translator's preface, including the fact that it singles out Condorcet's own pseudonymous reflections on slavery in a list of French abolitionist works. And there's a detailed argument that I won't pause on now, but I'm happy to return to it in the discussion if you like. So this list of authors in this footnote, there's a list of French authors. The footnote says, effectively, the English are now publishing a host of works in favor of blacks, and Europe applauds them for it. But I must point out that the author of the notes on Pascal's Pensées, which is Voltaire, and especially Lambert, Monsieur de Saint-Lambert, Monsieur l'Abbé Raynal, Monsieur Garat, that all of these figures, and especially Monsieur Schwartz, which is the pseudonym for Condorcet's book, have all written with great force against the slavery of the blacks. So it turns out that this list of authors, so not only does it kind of highlight Schwartz, who is Condorcet, but also this list of authors is nearly identical to a similar list of anti-slavery writers that appears in a different manuscript by Condorcet. And for that observation, we are indebted to the Condorcet scholar Gabriel Dariulla, who noticed that and told me about it. So for now, I won't dwell on other evidence for the attribution, but as I say, I'm happy to talk more about it in the discussion. I also won't say much more for the moment about possible objections to this argument, alternative attributions that have been made in the past, but I'm also happy to discuss those. Just briefly on some possible objections, it's true that Cugoano and his book are never mentioned in Condorcet's papers and correspondence, nor is there any direct correspondence between Condorcet and Piattoli. As I've noted, although Royer advertised the work during Condorcet's lifetime, it was never with Condorcet's name attached to it. It was only an anonymous translation. But I think it's also worth pointing out that he did advertise it with Condorcet's name attached during the life of Sophie de Grouchy, who would have been in a position, who was working with Royer and would have been in a position to object to a false attribution. She was working with him on the publication of a posthumous work of Condorcet's on calculus, and in the advertisement for that book, the Cugoano translation is mentioned. Oh, I have a thing that I can point. Oops, I don't know how to. There we go. So, he's saying there are also other books by Condorcet for sale, including this translation. The presence of Sophie de Grouchy in this story raises the tantalizing possibility that she and Condorcet might have collaborated on the Cugoano translation. As I mentioned, they did on Mazzei's book during the same year. Although there's little evidence about Condorcet's facility as a translator, Grouchy herself was not only her husband's close intellectual collaborator, she was also a talented translator from the English. She was later to translate Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments, accompanied by her own Letters on Sympathy, which she published in 1798, after the deaths of both Smith and Condorcet, because, according to her daughter Eliza, she needed money to support herself and Eliza after her assets had been confiscated by the revolution. In addition to the Mazzei book, she may also have translated a letter by Thomas Paine in the journal Le Républicain in 1791, as Sandrine Bergès and Eric Schließer have argued. And Kathleen McCrudden-Illert, in her new book, Republic of Sympathy, has documented Grouchy's intellectual contributions to Condorcet's projects in much greater detail than was previously known. Grouchy was also interested in the slave trade at this time, it's worth noting. She was the first woman to join the Société des Amis des Noirs, where she was introduced by Condorcet in June 1789. And she can be seen collaborating with Condorcet on the situation in the French colonies in a couple of manuscripts, to which I'm indebted to Kathleen Illert for directing me to. one in which she writes to Brissot on Condorcet's behalf, and another in which she appears to have commented on sections of a piece by Condorcet discussing a decree of 1792 that gave limited rights to free blacks in Saint-Domingue. In the letter to Brissot, Grouchy writes of Condorcet's desire to send to the society through Brissot what she calls a feeble tribute that his fortune permits him to offer at this moment. And I think this is interesting also as an indication that Condorcet was devoting not just his time, but also his funds to the degree that he could. And this makes the idea that he could have funded the translation, the publication of the translation, with at least some of his own money. That makes that idea plausible as well. So while we can't definitively prove that Condorcet was the moving force behind this translation, I hope to have convinced you that it's plausible that he was, and that the possibility of a collaboration on the translation with Sophie de Grouchy may make the case even more plausible. In the time remaining, which is, how much time do I have? I want to reflect on the significance of this possibility. I want to reflect on the significance of this possibility. What do we know about Condorcet's own anti-slavery commitments, both before and during the Revolution, that makes it plausible and important that he might have undertaken this translation and publication in 1788? So Condorcet had a long-standing interest in intellectual engagement with Africans, as well as a long-standing commitment to anti-slavery. His interest in intellectual engagement with Africans went back to his earliest mention of slavery in a 1773 letter to Benjamin Franklin, and he reiterated it repeatedly in his anti-slavery writings. He was a long-standing critic of racism, as this passage from his notes to the Pensées of Pascal suggests. So he says, tearing men from their country by treachery and violence, accustoming ourselves to make no difference between them and animals, this is how we treat other men. It would be a horrible barbarity if these men were white, but they are black, and that changes all our ideas. The American forgets that nègres are men. He has no moral relationship with them. They are nothing for him but an object of profit. So I think you can see some resonances with the arguments that Cugoano was making. His most extensive piece of anti-slavery writing was his own Réflexions sur l'esclavage des nègres, the book he published in 1781 under, as I've mentioned, the persona, the ostentatiously pseudonymous persona of Monsieur Schwartz, an evangelical pastor in Switzerland. The Schwartz book begins with a dedicatory letter aux nègres esclaves, whom he addresses as his friends and brothers, lamenting the obstacles that prevent communication between them and himself. So again, this idea of a kind of yearning for intellectual connection with Africans is present earlier in his writings. Cugoano's book then offered access to an extended argument in multiple registers, philosophical, scriptural, legal, economic, and political, giving him access to precisely the kind of intellectual connection with Africans that he had long been expressing a desire for. He published a second edition of that book in 1788. That's the middle one. There you can see another Par Condorcet inscription. 1788, the year the Société des Amis des Noirs was founded, the year the Cugoano translation was published, and a year when the cause of abolition was at the top of his political agenda. The 1788 edition has a few changes, a few additions, especially referring to developments in the United States, but I'm sorry to say no changes that clearly indicate engagement with Cugoano's book, to my disappointment. In the Schwartz Reflections, Condorcet had argued that the total abolition of slavery would require careful preparation, firmness, and dedication on the part of those friends of reason, justice, and humanity who were committed to total abolition. For the revolution, he said, that would be needed to bring about the abolition of slavery, both the sovereign and public opinion would have to be convinced. It's notable, that is, that the dual printing strategy of the French edition of Cugoano's text and a cheaper edition for widespread distribution and an elite edition, including a copy sent to the king, realized a project that Condorcet had already outlined. We have to convince the public, we have to convince the sovereign. Condorcet also shared a number of anti-slavery commitments with Cugoano. And here's the dedication to the slaves. One is an emphasis on the distinct criminality of slavery. This had been a central theme of Condorcet's first extended critique of slavery in 1776 in the Remarks on Pascal. There he discussed slavery as an illustration of the great harm to humanity that's caused by crimes people commit without remorse because of their social context. Because, as he wrote, habit or false consciousness lead us to think of them as innocent or even virtuous. So he's interested in the criminality of slavery and the and the social context that makes that criminality sort of invisible to its participants, or that gives them plausible deniability, you could say. The criminality of slavery and the fact that slavery remained a crime, even if it was condoned by law and public opinion, was also central to his argument in the 1781 Schwartz Reflections. In their insistence on the criminality of slavery, both Cugoano and Condorcet thus, I think, avoid the humanitarian and sentimental vein that was common in abolitionist work at the time. While the general view that slavery violates universal and natural rights or natural laws was, of course, widely held among abolitionists, Cugoano and Condorcet shared a more particular set of commitments following from the idea that enslavement is an egregious crime. Both argued that enslavement confers no property rights, that any slaveholder claims for restitution if slavery were abolished would be outrageous, and that, on the contrary, restitution is due from slaveholders to emancipated slaves. According to Cugoano's translator, that's getting ahead of ourselves, I think. According to Cugoano's translator, the book was both a powerful argument for the criminality of slavery and itself evidence of the ability of enslaved people to overcome the effects of slavery's brutality. So the translator wrote, "The good Cugoano demonstrates that slavery is a crime, and his work and his abilities prove that blacks are not degenerate men, that they can have virtues and talents. African slaves have vices, yes, but their vices are the work of colonists. They are born with feelings for the good. They resemble those of all people raised in a state of semi-savagery and have never been an obstacle to civilization." So there again, I think you hear some of Condorcet's persistent preoccupations, his preoccupation with the criminality of slavery, his anti-racism, and also his civilizational language, which becomes pronounced in his later sketch on human history, where he has a pronounced kind of civilizational mission argument. So there are, I think, a lot of similarities between the arguments of Cugoano and Condorcet that mark them out from the run-of-the-mill abolitionism of the time. But I would argue that the significance of Condorcet's possible role in the translation may lie less in the points of agreement with Cugoano than in their most glaring difference. And that is that where Cugoano called for immediate abolition, Condorcet was a consistent gradualist. So although Condorcet argued that immediate abolition was the only means of destroying slavery in rigorous conformity with justice, he held that pragmatic considerations told against the immediate abolition of slavery. In the Schwartz Reflections, he argued that the brutalization of slaves by the experience of enslavement made them temporarily incapable of exercising their natural rights, and so required a period of adjustment in which not only were they not eligible for full legal rights, but would remain enslaved, some for many years, with the result that slavery would be fully eradicated only in 70 years, roughly 3 generations. His gradualism, it must also be said, continued throughout the revolutionary period when he focused his efforts on the abolition of the trade rather than slavery. In an appeal to the French electorate in 1789 to include abolition in their Cahiers de doléances, he wrote, "We realize these evils can't be repaired without precautions. We thus do not demand the current destruction of these evils." Condorcet's gradualism has become somewhat notorious in recent scholarship. Laurent Dubois has called Condorcet's position a kind of Republican racism in that he used an abolitionist history of the brutality of slavery to justify continued racial exclusion. Elizabeth Anderson has argued that Condorcet's authoritarian social epistemology meant he was incapable of imagining that the enslaved might have something to teach Europeans about justice. Anderson, Dubois, and other critics are right to point to the troubling inconsistencies of the gradualist program in the Reflections, particularly its willingness to consign the enslaved during the transitional period to the control and guidance of the white planters, whom Condorcet so repeatedly condemned as morally depraved criminals. Yet, if Condorcet was indeed the primary agent responsible for publishing a translation of Cugoano's book, his abolitionism and his social epistemology appear in a new light. Condorcet's efforts to make Cugoano's treatise available to the French public would indicate his eagerness to circulate ideas more radical than he was willing to avow under his own name, including a powerful case for immediate abolition, as well as his confidence that he and other Europeans had much to learn from enslaved Africans. While I haven't found definitive evidence of Cugoano's influence in Condorcet's post-1788 writings, it does seem possible, I think, to discern some echoes. In one unpublished Lettre Marquis, the text that displays the list of authors that I showed you earlier, a few passages are worth noting. I'll mention just one. There he argues that if the citizens of a free country do not denounce the slave trade and slaveholders among them, they make themselves accomplices in the crime and share their guilt. So there's kind of taking on board the national guilt argument. And then in a slightly later manuscript, he delves into the question of replacing the slave trade with a beneficial commerce with Africa, which is, again, one of Cugoano's key themes. I want to conclude with a few tentative suggestions about what this episode may tell us about the French abolitionist movement in comparison with the British. Like Cugoano's English original, the French translation unfortunately seems to have enjoyed only limited circulation. The bookseller Royer continued to advertise copies for sale into the early years of the 19th century, suggesting that he had anticipated far greater sales than the book actually had in 1788, and that a number of copies were available as late as 1805. And in fact, it's quite hard to find existing copies of the book. We've only found 4 or so in France, a handful in the US, and maybe 1 or 2 in Britain. But the reason for the book's failure to circulate, so you might say, it didn't circulate in England, it didn't circulate in France, what's the difference? I have an argument about the difference. I think the reason for the book's failure to circulate widely in France may have been quite different from the reasons for the publishing fiasco in England, where it seems that the book's radicalism led the English society to keep it at arm's length. French abolitionists were, it seems, prepared to champion the book in a way that their English counterparts were not. Someone, as I've said, clearly made a serious investment in its translation and publication. And then in May 1790, as the current slide shows, the Société des Amis des Noirs listed the translation in Brissot's journal Le Patriote Français among noteworthy abolitionist works in their collection. They said, you can come to the society and look at these works in our collection. Here are English works, here are French works, and they list both Condorcet's work and just below it, the Cugoano translation. So they weren't sidelining it in the way the English were. But it doesn't seem to have made much headway. And this may be because the profound disruption to public and private life occasioned by the revolution may have led to slow sales of the reflections. The Société clearly believed something like this, given that they quickly abandoned their ambitious project of publishing translations of English abolitionist works, which had been their declared main agenda when they first started convening in February of 1788. By May, they were saying, current circumstances absorbing all public attention, we risk in publishing translations of English works not being read, and so we're going to stop that publication strategy that was at the top of our agenda. The very different fates in England and France of another Afro-British author's book lend, I think, support to this idea. So the celebrated work, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, by Cugoano's friend and fellow leader of the abolitionist group, the Sons of Africa, was published in London in 1789. In England, Equiano's book, with its more conciliatory tone and gradualist approach to abolition, was embraced by the London Committee, supported by extensive subscriptions, and frequently republished. It went into 9 English editions before Equiano's death in 1797, and it was translated into Dutch, German, and Russian. Dutch in 1790, German 1792, Russian 1794. But Equiano's book was published after the progress of the revolution had interrupted the translation activities of the society, and it was not translated into French in the 18th century, and indeed no French edition was printed for nearly 200 years. The course of abolition in France and Britain was also very different. The British abolitionists, earlier to organize, had a much more robust network of supporters with anti-slavery societies in all the major cities. They had a vast project to gather evidence of slavery's brutality and a powerfully orchestrated program to publish and distribute books and pamphlets denouncing slavery and the slave trade. Even so, Britain first abolished the trade only in 1807 and slavery in 1833. Slavery was initially abolished much earlier in the French Empire on February 4th, 1794, by the famous decree of the 16th Pluviose en deux, the moment represented in this drawing by Nicolas-André Monsiau. As scholars of abolition have emphasized, however, the convention's vote to abolish slavery was by no means due to the simple triumph of Republican or humanitarian argument. Rather, under the pressure of slave uprisings in Saint-Domingue beginning in August 1791, France's commissioners in the colony, Sonthonax and Polverel, had ordered the abolition of slavery in a series of decrees in the summer of 1793, with the news of their actions not reaching Paris for months. This decision was belatedly ratified by the convention's February 1794 vote, a decision that Jeremy Popkin has described as impulsive, though C.L.R. James celebrated it as the triumph of the noble and generous working people of France, who, as he said, all over France were filled with a virulent hatred of the aristocracy of the skin. Yet the translation of Cugoano's book stands as compelling evidence of something further that is important for understanding the course of abolition in France. And for this thought, I want to thank Stephen Sawyer, who had a really interesting conversation about this in Paris last year. And that is the coexistence of multiple temporalities of abolition, of arguments for what was necessary, on the one hand, immediate emancipation, as Condorcet repeatedly insisted, alongside plans for what was possible, abolition by stages. Even if their main agenda was a pragmatic program of gradualism, the French abolitionists showed themselves to be less reluctant than their British models to sponsor a radical call for immediate emancipation. And they seized the opportunity for immediate abolition of slavery when it presented itself through this series of events, the Sonthonax decree and the opening in 1794. So the first French abolition was the product of a combination of rebellion by the enslaved and the action of elites who were ready to seize the moment. However, because the French abolitionist movement was less deeply rooted in society than the British campaign, the decision was also less stable. When Napoleon reinstated slavery in 1802, he encountered no generalized resistance. In Britain, the evolution of abolition was slower, but more solidly anchored in the wider population, arguably. France's elite anti-slavery lobby bore little resemblance to the extensive, regionally dispersed movement in Britain, and even less to the vast national project of repentance and restitution envisioned by Cugoano. For Cugoano's program of immediate abolition was only one part of his strategy for the recognition of European society's complicity in slavery. He believed that the work of reparation and restitution would require the engagement of the whole society over a long period. His profound vision of the multi-generational work necessary for confronting the legacies of slavery forms, I think, part of the intellectual history, not just of British abolitionism, but also of the French Revolution. So, with that, I'll stop.
Thank you.
Should I join you here?
Oh, wherever you want, wherever you're most comfortable. I had a question burning throughout that you then answered at the very end, which was, thinking about, traditionally we tend to think of the British abolitionist movement as the stronger one, right? And so my question had to do with sort of what, to what do you attribute that? The fact that, the French are doing this more radical, circulation of ideas, but you kind of already addressed that. So I think I will open the floor to questions. And, we've got a couple already. Art Goldhammer. And tell us who you are. Art Goldhammer, David, and then Steve. Yeah.
Okay, I'm Art Goldhammer. It's nice to hear about a translation that outshines the original. You told us a good deal about the translation itself, and I had two questions that follow from that. One was that although, assuming that Condorcet was in fact the translator, you noted that his approach to abolition was more gradualist. And yet in the translation, you showed that he often radicalized the wording, using the word ransom, for example, which was not present in English. So I wonder if you have any comment about that. And then the second point is, you've told us a great deal about the translation, but not much about the reception. And perhaps that's because the book didn't circulate that very widely, but do you know anything about who read it and how they might have read it, and why it had less influence on some subsequent writers like Tocqueville, who certainly did not take to heart the point that enslavement did not establish any property rights in the slave.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So why would Condorcet, what I'm trying to suggest is that although Condorcet was, for pragmatic reasons, not prepared to champion immediate abolition in his own name in the moment, if he was responsible for this translation, he was interested in getting that argument into the French public sphere and giving it go and and letting it roll, to its fullest extent possible. So it's not, part of what I was trying to show is that the translation doesn't pull any punches in representing the radicalism of Cugoano's argument. I don't think it mistranslates or radicalizes beyond what the text permits. I just think that where the text is ambiguous, it pushes things a little farther. As you say, it introduces the word ransom, which isn't there in Cugoano. And the avarice point, avarice, the term, is all over the Cugoano and other parts. So it's partly a matter of gathering in certain places the full force of the argument. And the translator complains in the preface that Cugoano's book is very verbose and that this is a standard problem with, and you see this in the Société des Amis des Noirs, they're complaining, and in these translations, the English are so verbose and repetitive, and when we make these translations, we're gonna have to really cut things down and make it more pithy, because the English go on and on.
You certainly took liberties in compressing the text.
Yeah, so there are some liberties, and also particularly in all the biblical passages, I think, there's also, I think those would have had less uptake for a French audience anyway, so I don't think it's just the translator, but I think it's also a recognition of kind of what's of interest to the audience. It's a pretty faithful translation throughout, I would say, but there are, those biblical sections do get cut back. So that was what I'm trying to suggest, that I think, this suggests that I can't say exactly why Condorcet was not willing to speak, multiple things in multiple strategies in his own voice. Even the Schwartz reflections were not in his own voice officially, although as you saw in 1790 he was acknowledging it, and even before that it was widely known to be his. In the letter to a marquis, which was unpublished, I highlighted a place where I think he's pushing the immediate abolition point a little more strongly, or maybe I took that part out. So I think it's possible to find traces, but I think he was being pragmatic in his public writings. As far as the reception, yeah, it's very hard to figure out the reception because I don't think it sold very much and there wasn't much uptake of it. The copies that we know to exist, so Moreau de Saint-Méry, the planter and member of the Massiac Club, the kind of major pro-slavery lobbyist who was also a colonial governor who had a huge library of texts on slavery. He has a copy in his collection has descended to the Bibliothèque Nationale, and there's a copy there. There's a copy in the Abbé Grégoire library, but as far as I can tell, that's a coincidence. It doesn't seem to have been owned by Abbé Grégoire is known to have read it, and he talks about it, and he's actually the source of a funny moment of misunderstanding and mistranslation, which another scholar has pointed out in a brief article. Cugoano says at one moment that he was delivered by, he says something about Jehovah Sabaoth, which is the Lord of Hosts, delivered me from slavery. And the translation renders this as Lord Host. Seemingly, and I spent a fair amount of time puzzling about this. Is the translator somebody who's kind of not very savvy about religious language? Because Jehovah Sabaoth is translated normally in French, I understand, by Dieu des armées, and they just don't say that. They say Lord Host, which doesn't really make any sense. And then Abbé Grégoire further mangles things by reading that as Lord Hoth and assuming that Lord Hoth was an English aristocrat who had helped Cugoano escape from slavery. So there's this chain of misunderstanding.
Oh my God.
So Abbé Grégoire definitely read it. Moreau de Saint-Méry seems to have read it. Beyond that, there's very little to go on.
That's fascinating. David?
David Armitage, verbose Englishman. One question about the translation, going back to the Jeremiad point. A Jeremiad, and it's true in Cugoano's case, is always addressed to an erring nation, and the erring nation in the Thoughts and Sentiments is very clearly England or Britain. Is the translation in any way changed, as it were, to universalize it, to take it away from the charge against England? And then two smaller points. One, it's not entirely the case that the Thoughts and Sentiments have no afterlife. There is that shorter sort of 40-page condensation, and I wonder if you have any evidence that there was any knowledge of that version in France at all?
That I don't know. I don't know of any knowledge of that translation in France. And that one did have a subscription list as well,
Right.
but very limited compared to the subscription list of somebody like Equiano. Yeah, it's a really good question about the Aryan nation. It's fairly specifically written. It does also talk about European nations, so it tacks a little bit back and forth between specifically being about England. I have looked at this with something like your question in mind, and I don't remember exactly now, but I think basically it's pretty faithful. So it talks about the English rather than, it doesn't kind of systematically change English into European or something like that.
Interesting.
It just renders what Cugoano says. But there's enough targeting of European civilization in the Cugoano that it translates, I think. I think, one question that arises about the difference between the two circumstances is that Britain in 1787 is by no means a democratic society, but there is more of a sense of a nation that's responsible for the activities of its government than I think there is in France in 1788. And I think there's some interesting moments in Condorcet's writing during the Revolution where he does suggest that, as we become a nation politically responsible for ourselves, we also take on the guilt of slavery.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, I think Steve was next, and then next to you.
Thank you, and it's just a fascinating project, and I have a lot of things in mind here that I'd like to ask, but I'll sort of restrict it to just one brief comment, and it's the Robespierre in his speeches on the condition of blacks really plays with the whole brutalization argument and sort of turns it on its head, and I'd be happy to see those. But there's a way in which which would echo sort of where you ended up. The other question kind of goes back to what David just said and your response, and it's about this question of the place of law, sort of contextualizing the place of law, where Condorcet sits in relation to the debates with the Parlement, and his line, and I'm just drawing from what I've seen on your slides, but the argument about you would need a strong sovereign will combined with public opinion or a more constant legislative power. And Condorcet is very in favor of the creation of provincial assemblies and a whole set of reforms which he sees in many ways as anti-English but essential to creating new forms of participatory government that would reinforce sovereign will. And so in some ways it's sort of, so I guess the question in that is, have you had a chance to sort of try to situate, because that would explain why he takes out the law things, that's going to get, and the religious stuff, that's going to get him into the Jansenism debates, that's going to get him into, you know what I mean? That's just going to take him into this. Whereas he's sort of, and so there, it seems that there's almost a position he's taking in there about royal reform. And of course, he's very enthusiastic about the end of feudalism and all forms of feudal seigneurialism on royal domains that is established in the 1770s and 1780s. Which is immediate, with no compensation. So in any case, it was just sort of, have you had a chance to sort of dig into some of those elements, or is that something,
It's a great idea, yeah, no, I haven't really, and in fact I'm tempted to go back to that slide, I read the sovereign will as the will of the sovereign monarch, and I didn't read it more broad. I mean, that's a line from 1781.
But it crosses the revolutionary divide very well, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Just see if I can find it quickly. Result of a sovereign's own will. Yeah, I don't know if it's because of the...
Sovereign's own will suggests, well...
Cependant, il faudrait que la révolution fût l'effet de la volonté propre d'un souverain appuyé par l'opinion publique. So I read that as a monarch applied to, but
I'm sure that's what he means.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that it can't be considering what ultimately happened.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. I will take that under advisement, I haven't thought about that. On the provincial assemblies, I mean, I think the fact that he made an appeal about the Cahiers de Doléances and saying, made an appeal to the bailliage, is that what they're called? The bailliage, that they include, there's several moments in his revolutionary abolitionism career where he's appealing to provincial actors to include abolitionism in their agendas. So thank you, that's a great suggestion. Please.
Thank you. On the topic of the difference between Equiano and Cugoano and the difference between the reception of those two texts in France, you mentioned the temporalities of anti-slavery and abolition, and that seems right to me. That could have a lot to do with the difference between those two receptions. But I was wondering about maybe two other factors, differences between British and French slavery debates right at this time. On the one hand, it seems to me that the cause of British anti-slavery was much more focused on the trade at this point than it was on the abolition of slavery as such. And in that respect, Equiano, critic of the trade, but not so much a thoroughgoing critic of slavery as such, was more characteristically English, and Cugoano was an unusual, presented an unusual proposal in that context. Now on the other point, it's not so much the case that the Equiano book was presented straightforwardly in the context of debates about slavery and the slave trade. It was much more presented directly in the context of debate about race and racism, in which Wheatley, Jefferson, Hume, the classic line of text, was kind of what he was trying to respond to. And the reflections on slavery and the slave trade play only a part of the role, but in a sense, the point of that text is like the text itself. Whereas Cugoano is more characteristically French in the sense that with less of his argument is more characteristically French, in the sense that his focus is less on his own story and on the problem of race, what was seen as the problem of race, than it is on the juridical arguments about slavery, the rightness or wrongness of slavery, the rightness or wrongness of restitution, the laws on slavery, the ancient biblical precedents and how far modern slavery departs from those, the difference between slavery in Africa and slavery in the colonies and so on. And in that respect, Cugoano is very different from the focus of Equiano and seemingly more put into the context of French anti-slavery debate, which was more along those lines, at least in my sense, right at this time. So I wonder how those two factors might sound to you also.
I'm not sure, I mean, I don't know that Cugoano had any knowledge of French debate. I don't think I don't think it makes sense. I mean, it might be that there was uptake of his arguments in France because there were ways, I mean, that's what I've tried to suggest with the echoes between his argument and Condorcet, that there were ways in which his argument he had affinities between his argument and Condorcet's, and so there was enthusiasm for it. But I don't think there's anything French as such in Cugoano's argument. Am I misunderstanding your question?
No, I'm saying precisely what you're
Okay.
saying, that his work slotted into French debates much more smoothly than that of Equiano.
I mean, I don't know. That might be have a longer conversation about British abolitionism, but it strikes me that, as I've said, I think in the context of British abolitionism, it was making much more radical arguments than most people were prepared to make, and I think that was, what explains its lack of uptake and its different fate from Equiano's text, etc. I'm not sure that you can separate the debate about racism and the debate about slavery as neatly as you seem to be doing. I think Equiano's is an intervention in both, but more emphatically about the slave trade, for sure. And that's, again, that's why I think it was easier for the British abolitionists to champion him.
Okay, I have three people in line, Cheryl, and then these two in the back here, you and you.
I'm Cheryl Welch, and so I had a question, Jennifer, about something that I may have misunderstood when you went through your early thing, but it seemed that you were saying a nuance of the French translation was to highlight the theme of a possible retributive slave uprising,
Yes.
which would be justified but terrible. And so I was really intrigued because I've been reading a lot of early 19th century abolitionist stuff, literature and whatever, and that is a distinct theme in France, but almost everyone attributes it to the sort of cultural angst over Saint-Domingue. This is before Saint-Domingue. So I was just really interested in what would be the source of that nuance, which and it always struck me as it's more than just a sort of worry about their own history, but I don't know what it is. So I just wondered why that nuance and where could it come from?
Yeah, I think those are really interesting questions. I mean, I think the first thing to say is it's possible to read Cugoano as saying that, although he doesn't come out and say it. So it may just be an effort on the part of the translator to say, this is what's going on in this text. The Saint-Domingue, I mean, certainly slave rebellions were going on before the 1791 eruption of full revolution in Saint-Domingue. So for that reason, I think, and the slave owners were constantly in a panic about it. So I think it was available as a thought well before that. There was one other thing I was going to say about that. The Abbé Raynal, all is needed as a leader. Like that, there's a maybe an older history of thinking about slave uprisings in the abolitionist literature as well. But I guess what I would suggest is, although it becomes, a widespread preoccupation after 1791 in Saint-Domingue, it's not absent before.
And just another quick question about the reception of the translation and why it kind of dies. And you talked about the interruptions of the revolution, but isn't there a more sort of commonplace answer that the Société des Émigrés Noirs is so associated with the Girondins that when they're gone, I mean, they're smashed, right? So it would just it would die in the wake of that, and then probably not be revived, maybe.
Yeah, but slavery is abolished after the Girondin purge.
Yes,
that's true.
but
yeah, it's not. I guess it's not obvious that it would be legible as a specifically Girondin object.
Interesting. Okay, in the back.
Hi, I'm Abby Lebeau. I'm a PhD student in government. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about Sophie de Grouchy's involvement, and if she is taken to be possibly the translator, does that then reflect in any of the writings you have attributed to her, like consistency, or does it reflect in her did she make similar translation choices in translating Smith? And can we think about that as kind of a political project?
Yeah, those are questions that I've asked myself, and I haven't done. I'm not sure. I don't know what it would take to find the kind of smoking gun that says, she translated Smith like this and Cugoano like this. And I do think, I have sort of persuaded myself in the course of working on this that the probable, this is all rather speculative, but that the probable course of things was that she maybe was responsible for much of the translation, and he wrote the preface. And I think that the kinds of things like the list of authors being the same in the two documents, and the fact that Piatterly sent it to him, it feels like the author of the preface is Condorcet, but I think that the possibility that she was largely responsible for the translation seems quite high to me. And the Matsei translation is another example, and there's a memoir of somebody else who talks about that and says she was unhappy with the translation that existed, and she was kind of lobbying her. She basically persuaded her husband to work on this on a revised translation of this document with her because she was so unsatisfied with it. So she seems to have been the driving force in the translation department. I have tried to read her letters on sympathy with the question in mind, like, is the person who wrote these somebody who would have really engaged with Cugoano? And it's, again, I haven't found any smoking guns that say, oh, you know, and slavery is actually, I think, almost oddly absent from there in the sense that there are moments in the course of that discussion, you know, in talking about what it means to sympathize with the pain of others and that kind of thing, where somebody with abolitionist sympathies, you might think it obvious that they would interject a sentence on slavery, and as far as I know, she doesn't at all. And I don't know what to make of that, but there are sentences in the letters on sympathy where I'm tempted to say, this feels like it was written by somebody who had been reading Cugoano. I just don't feel super confident about it.
Okay, in the white sweater, and then Eric Chapman.
Sure. I'm Sarah Greenberg, and I'm interested in, I guess, the politics of the biblical translations or where they're not translated. And the example of the sort of 7-year freedom emancipation cycle, right, is a direct reference to like the release years and the Jubilee years that are in Hebrew Bible. And I sort of like, I'm wondering on the one hand, is the sort of biblical reference in Cugoano, like the language of emancipation that he's offering an appeal to biblical authority, and why that doesn't show up in the French? Is it an audience question? Like the French just like wouldn't find that persuasive? Or is there like a politics of not including those references and sort of keeping out some of Cugoano's own language of explaining the critique? Is it prefiguring the separation of church and state that we see in the revolution? Is there something else going on? Is that something you've considered?
Basically, I haven't gotten beyond your question. I mean, yeah, I think it's a question, you know, I think they're sort of related in the sense that the context of abolitionist debate in France is just not a Protestant/dissenting kind of debate in the way that it is in England. And so those biblical resonances, I think, just don't have the same, I mean, the biblical passages don't have the same resonance for either the protagonists or their audience. I mean, I think in general, it's a much more elite project. They're, you know, as I was saying, the British and Michael Suarez has done a lot of work on the publishing strategy of the English abolitionist movement and how extraordinarily widespread it was and how many pages they printed, and it was just a vast undertaking. It was situated, you know, in medium-sized towns all over England. It was very widely distributed, and it had a big audience. The French was just nothing like that. So I don't know that they had much of an audience, or how much of an audience they had. This is something that I should probably do more work on. So I think it's some combination of the language just didn't have resonance for any of the participants in the same way that it did in England. And, you know, if you're a French translator/publisher who thinks that the English are too verbose and you need to get pithy, like that just seems like obvious places. I mean, he does go on at extraordinary length in the reading, and it's, you know, at moments I think kind of funny. Like I think the thing about the Cornwall and the, you know, he's not a very funny writer because it's not a very funny subject, but there are moments when there are, you know, little bits of irony you get in, but it just seems like an obvious set of references to cut for all those reasons. I thought about the Jubilee point too, but I don't know quite what to say about it. Yeah, I don't have any thoughts about that. It seems like a likely source of his choice of 7 years is the term. But.
It's funny to think about because generally I think of French as being much more verbose than English. I mean, like there's less of a direct way of writing. You have to like put in 3 things to say one thing, like compared to English. I mean, if translation would be longer in French, then I don't know whether that would have any, it probably has no valence here, but it's interesting to think of English as being more verbose. I mean,
It's
the
just
language itself is not, he was as an author, I guess, is what you're suggesting.
Except that the Abolitionist Society said this about all English abolitionism. Like in general, this is a problem with English texts. And
They're
we need to-
repetitive.
Yeah, they're repetitive.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Herrick Chapman?
I'm curious about the transatlantic context in which he wrote this. This is immediately after the American Revolution.
Yeah.
That he publishes it. And the extent to which that figures into the way he looks at these questions.
Yeah, that's a great question that I haven't looked into enough, and I don't really have much to say about it. I mean, vis-a-vis Condorcet, the one thing I can say is he was very interested in the Pennsylvania Constitution's gradualism plan, and he picked that up and incorporated it into his own thinking. Cugoano, I honestly don't know what his thoughts about the United States and kind of the North American scene were. David may.
If you take the Chris Brown argument that it's the American Revolution that makes abolition more thinkable, I think that's a very important and illuminating frame for Cugoano. You could think about his reflections on debt, of course being very much in a dialogue with Smith, but also coming out of that sense of a succession of major wars, the 7 Years' War, the American War, the impact of that on Britain, how that is a moral judgment. All of those things can stack up in a very different way without him saying a single word about what he thinks about American independence or the state constitutions, for instance.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm curious about the reparations part of the, or the restitution part of the argument. Of course, you know, the French don't pay reparations until 1848, and they pay them to the planters. And then, of course, there's the Haitian indemnity, which is not correct, and is not in theory for the actual enslaved people. It's for the property, although the property is valued by virtue of how many slaves worked on it. I've actually looked at some of those archives. They're very interesting. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, you know, as Condorcet presumably, or his wife, are translating this particular aspect of Cugoano, I mean, are there, I guess, French considerations about restitution or reparation that they're taking into account? I mean, this is, you've mentioned their own property, or Grouchy's property being seized by virtue of the Jacobin period of the Revolution. I guess I'm just wondering whether that's possibly playing into this at all or not. I mean, I don't really know. This is not, you know, something I'm that well versed in, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, their property was seized after the translation was done, so.
Yeah, it was after, okay. The publication history.
Was 1788.
Yeah, right, that's right, okay. But is there a French, well, this would have been before the 1794 emancipation, so there's not really any kind of referent point then for.
No, I mean, Condorcet in the Schwartz book.
Sorry.
I'm wondering if that's mine. Okay. Says, you know, he and Cugoano, both at various points, he in the Schwartz book and Cugoano in his book, say there are no property rights. You know, slavery is theft, therefore there are no property rights in the slave or the labor of the slave. Therefore, restitution is illegitimate. And Condorcet has an argument in the Schwartz reflection about basically the obligation of masters. You know, once things are put on a course to abolition, masters are obliged to pay for the health care and upkeep of slaves who are too old to work, and that they have a duty to so there are kind of restitutive duties that he's theorizing before reading Cugoano, but they're much less extensive. I mean, what Cugoano is talking about is a national project of collective reckoning of our collective guilt and some kind of reparation. Again, on this point that has been picked up, you know, recently by, as I mentioned, Saidiya Hartman and more recently David Scott, about the idea of making reparations for an evil that is, by definition, irreparable. How do you even think about the paradox of it, of reparations for the irreparable? And I'm not sure that, I mean, I need to, again, look maybe a little more closely at some of the passages in the translation, but maybe this is a point that the translator is just not picking up on because they don't have the harrowing experience of slavery that Cugoano does to think about what, to contemplate the idea that this is an irreparable evil.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I guess I can't help but think, and especially some of the language that is around Louis XVI's reforms and the abolition of feudalism on August 4th, and all the questions of reparations that start with the debates and the constant references to this is a form of ownership, this is a form of peoples, the debates around trying to replace this with some sort of corvée that would be, it's tied to labor, it's tied to, and so there is an extensive discussion of reparations. And then the committee on the end of feudalism that's created in the Constitution right after August 4th, this is like their major thing. How much should they get anything? And then little by little, of course, after 1792, they're going to get less and less, and then afterwards, and then it's not until the Restoration that they say, and this comes back to Mary's point. It's really a 19th century question. Okay, we do actually have to, but as the story goes on.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that would be an interesting context, but it just does seem that they are thinking about these things.
Yeah, it is definitely an interesting context, and I just have to think about the sequencing of it. So these debates are coming after this, but but the question of restitution is in the air over this whole period. So yeah.
Sophie Wilkowski.
Hi, Sophie. I'm a PhD student. So another 7-year institution that came to mind was apprenticeship, and I wonder whether there's any language, either maybe especially in the Cugoano or in the Condorcet, about apprenticeship as a way of thinking about this period after emancipation, which would imply a sort of different relationship to work and what's been lost, I guess, or what's owed than the Jubilee framework. And I'd also just be curious to know a bit more about in what way. I think one of the commonalities you mentioned between these two, but between the text and its translation, or between the text and Condorcet's later writing, is the sort of the ways in which slavery is economically not beneficial to France. And I'm curious whether that's concern over public debts, whether it's some sense of like big companies and the kind of their monopolist problems, or whether it's even like an early sense of a world's market or balance of trade that's being imbalanced by this method of producing commodities. So I'd be curious to hear a little more.
Okay. Yeah, a few things. So on slavery not beneficial, I mean, I think Cugoano's point is that slavery has generated huge wealth for England, and yet it's highly unstable, and it's built on this dynamic of speculation and debt that is the kind of apocalyptic future that he's predicting. Is it divine vengeance? Is it the collapse of this debt speculation spiral? So it's not a claim that it's not profit making for anybody, or that it hasn't generated wealth for Britain. It's partly it's an argument, both of them in the Cugoano original and the translation. They address the point that some people may lose, and yet it's just to do this. And free labor ultimately in the long run can be more profitable. So I'm not sure that there's a definitive economic argument about whether, I think the argument is essentially it's generated huge profit, but this other course of action is not only just but also economically sound and more stable. On the apprenticeship versus Jubilee, I mean, the way that Cugoano talks about the 7-year period is, what I think is striking about it is, and I think I said this, although I can't remember if I took it out, that his point is that slavery hasn't, contra Condorcet's point in his Schwartz book, slavery hasn't brutalized people to the point that they can't be free. That the people who've been in the West Indies for longer are the ones that are ripe for freedom. The ones that he thinks are not ripe for freedom are the newly arrived people who have not been educated in Christianity, among other things. And I don't know to what degree this is an argument that's designed to appeal to his audience,
Right.
Versus to what degree he personally accepts the idea that people with less than 7 years in slavery would somehow be less fit for freedom. I'm honestly not sure what to do with that. But I think it's interesting that the point, against Condorcet, whose point is to be in slavery is to be so deeply brutalized that it's not clear that you're capable of exercising your freedom in a way that's safe for you and your fellow citizens. That's not Cubuano's argument at all.
That is extremely interesting. I'm just trying to reflect on what that implication of that is, because there's so much, I mean, the idea that Sophie brings up, of course, is very prevalent later, right? With
the apprenticeship.
1833 abolition, and then the French even sort of take up some of this idea in a little bit different of a way with this patronage, I don't know how you call it. It's sort of like patronage, it's not the right word. I'm thinking they're like godparent, parrainage, I suppose. What's that? Yeah. Anyway, in the context of, say, like the Caribbean and Guyana, they're thinking about, easing people into more freedom through a kind of godchild, godparent sort of relationship. Anyway, it's not exactly the same as what you see in the British Caribbean, but there's similarities. And then they're kind of still working for their putative master and basically like paying off their eventual freedom in so doing. So it's similar to an apprenticeship. Anyway, this is all much later, so that's neither here nor there, but I wonder whether there's like some early kind of exchange here of ideas between British abolitionists and French abolitionists about what will be necessary to actually achieve this. Does that make sense? Like, do you see, I mean, beyond, I assume you're situating Cubuano within a kind of larger frame, and do you see like other, besides that Cubuano, do you see other kinds of exchanges between British and French thinkers in this
Around
period
these questions,
around, whether it's around apprenticeship or around, around the idea of what would be necessary to actually accomplish a kind of abolition? I don't know. Does that make sense as a question?
It does, yeah. I'm afraid I don't have a good answer,
Yeah.
but as about the exchanges.
I mean, is the Société des Amis des Noirs not in some way kind of modeled on British abolitionism, except without the same Protestant
Very much so.
valence?
I mean, they're set up with the help of the British Abolitionist Society, and they very clearly in their early sessions, they're pointed. I mean, they say, we're here to do several things. We're here to be in contact with the British abolitionists. We're here to translate British abolitionist texts. And we're here to, there's a third thing on their agenda that I forgot for the moment, but 2 of the top 3 things that they named themselves to be doing at the beginning are directly bound up with the British abolitionists. I think, most of the British abolitionist texts that they're dealing with are slave trade abolitionism, I think.
Right.
Although, there's also a lot of document, it's mostly around the trade and Clarkson's, all of the work around Granville Sharp and Clarkson and the work around the horrific nature of the trade. I'm forgetting now there's Anthony Benezet is another person that they're translating who's originally French but then American. But as I said, this very ambitious translation program kind of comes to a grinding halt after a few months, and so they don't end up translating a lot. But you could, that Patriote Français list of all the works that they have in their possession is an interesting document about what they were reading and thinking about.
Sure.
You were talking about the 19th century, just another thought that crossed my mind as you were saying that is Tocqueville on the abolition of slavery. You know, one of the things that really stands out about his argument is you can't give the freed slaves land because then they won't work for the plantation operations. Basically, they need to be deprived of access to land ownership so that they can be pliable and cheap labor.
Right, which I think is a common, I mean, that's not just Tocqueville, right?
So that's another argument that's not about, you know, purported concern about whether they're capable of exercising freedom, but it's just a baldly, you know, economic argument about what's needed to keep the production of cash crops going.
Right, I mean, and, yeah, well, that's a longer conversation that we keep thinking about 19th century stuff, so I will stop doing that. Are there any further questions? Yes, David.
There's just a small one inspired by your collaboration with Mike Suarez. And one thing that seems superficially very different between the English and the French abolitionist campaigns is, as Mike has shown so brilliantly, the saturation of print and the circulation of print well beyond London into the provinces and the provincial reprintings. I may be completely ignorant, but I don't sense there's that same kind of national blanketing, the sending out to provincial printers, the abolition as an event in the history of print kind of aspect in France as well. So I don't want you to ventriloquize Mike, but you've no doubt talked to him a great deal. So could you give us a bit of a sense of the translation itself as an event, as a print event, and what that might tell us about some of the differences between the two campaigns?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's how we got into this project, because he had done all this work on precisely the role of printing in British abolitionism, and then we were interested in, you know, specifically in this translation, and then more broadly in, could you do something similar for France? I mean, I think the problem is precisely that you don't have the same phenomenon at all in France at this time, so it's, I don't know that there's much of a story to be told. I mean, the British story is fascinating, just he's documented the hundreds of thousands of pages that were printed, as you say, all across England. And I think it's just not the case for a variety of reasons, not least of which is just the larger political structure. But yeah, this is the next place we'd like to go, but I don't know where it will take us. I mean, I don't know if there's anywhere interesting to go pursuing the question of what does abolitionist printing look like in France.
I mean, I'm just looking on your slide, and it's published in Switzerland.
Well,
right?
it says it is. It's not actually.
Oh, okay, interesting.
That's one of those false Neuchâtel imprints, I think.
I see. All right, well, that ruins that argument. But still, I mean, so Paris, and then not much in the way of provincial publication as far as you can tell.
I think so, but I honestly haven't researched that in any way. I can't responsibly say that. I can say that there was not the vast operation that you had in Britain that he's documented.
I mean, it's a period in which, you know, obviously, I mean, Darnton and others have shown like an efflorescence of print, and yet it's heavily censored too. So, I mean, I would say arguably, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, David, but much more so in France than in Britain, which is why the Swiss thing I thought was real. But
I think that's right. I could be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure that that's a false Neuchâtel imprint.
so it kind of makes sense that there wouldn't be the vast kind of publication network that you see in Britain. And the whole like sort of subscription libraries and all that kind of stuff. I just don't know enough about this period of French history to know whether there's anything comparable, but my sense is not really. Steve, do you have any idea about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that. I also think it's the relationship between I'm sort of going back to, but I do also think it has to do with the networks and the relationship to the aristocracy and the nobility.
Yeah.
That's what I was just
And the way that again, I mean, this is part of a relatively elite group. And I think the point about the Brissautins, the Girondins is a very good one. If they're talking about, if they're sort of patterned on the British sort of system and this sort of Republican critique focused on trade, and we can talk about this later, but I would be very tempted to see, Condorcet is sitting somewhere else in that debate. And the emphasis on sovereign will is not a Republican position.
I see. Yeah, I would love to talk to you about this.
It's-
I mean, one thing about the Girondins is, the Gironde, Bordeaux is the center of the Gironde, and that's the major slave trading.
One of the major,
And
ports.
Brissot's relationship to the aristocracy and how he understood, that's a very, we can work with that. Condorcet is going to take much more radical positions as well. It's the monarch and the people, right? And you can only do those kinds of reforms with, in that kind of a context. And I'm not sure, I mean, I wouldn't want to push this too far, but I'd be very interested. I think it would be very interesting to see if some of those elisions are not also just critiques of a kind of the way the British are thinking about how this should happen, and the French approach, which is ultimately going to be exactly what they do. That's it's going to be the sovereign backed by public opinion, which is what they do on August 4th and what they do in 1794. But the way public opinion works, as we know from, but it has this kind of anti-aristocratic bent, and when you tie that into Saint-Domingue, and the way this is going to play out in terms of you destroy the aristocracy first, and then Saint-Domingue becomes a really then it becomes a really interesting and complicated problem. I'm just not sure Condorcet isn't choosing this text. I'm completely convinced that he's by your argument about that, and I actually think he sees this as an intervention into the debate, which in some ways is distinct from the Rousseau position, which is placing a new emphasis on sovereign will as an anti-republican position. And I think that would be important because it then makes the critiques about this sort of, which I think are very well done, but about a kind of republican gradualism or I'm not sure that Condorcet is particularly a Republican. In this sense, at least in the classics.
And Laurent Dubois uses Republican completely wrong. So I think, sorry, I like his work. I like his work generally, but that book is very frustrating because he has Republican. He refers to the Republic before there is a Republic. Now, there were Republicans before there was a Republic, for sure. But by and large, I mean, he doesn't really understand at that point. I think he probably does now. But at the time that he wrote that, he didn't really understand the concept of a constitutional monarchy. I don't think he just thought that the revolution led to the Republic. I don't know. He doesn't slow it down enough to sort of see these multiple shifts that are occurring and that you could actually argue for abolitionism as a kind of noblesse oblige sort of, the king grants, we want freedom from the monarch because he's the sovereign, and he at times suggests that that's a Republican argument. And my view is that, probably the slaves want freedom and they don't really care if they're getting it from a monarchy or a republic, So that book, I think has some, I wouldn't use it. I mean, I think the way you used it was fine, but I think I wouldn't use it as evidence of a Republican racism because I think it's actually much more nuanced and complex than that. So anyway, that's my little, now I'm on the record saying that on video, so hopefully Laurent doesn't, I love his work, but hopefully he doesn't watch this.
I think his point about Republican racism, his reading of that Condorcet's argument is slaves have been so brutalized. That's why, it's an abolitionist racism is maybe another way of putting it, that it's an argument
Yes.
based on the horrific nature of slavery to
Right.
deny former slaves' rights. And that's the
That,
point
that part
he's
I think
making.
is
And I think
legitimate.
that's fine as a reading of the Schwartz, and so what I'm just trying to do with suggesting, with the link to the Cugoano text is to say, and this goes with the epistemic, the authoritarianism as well, I don't think Condorcet was somebody who didn't think there was anything to learn from African slaves. I think on the contrary, he was on the record for a long time as deeply desiring intellectual connection. It sits very badly with this, extreme gradualism of the Schwartz argument, and I'm not here to defend that argument at all. I do think it's lamentable and also puzzling in relation to his view that, the only just course is immediate abolition, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
It's extraordinarily gradual. I mean, you could say the only just course is immediate abolition. We need some gradualism, but 70 years is a very, very gradual.
Yeah, that's very gradual. One last comment here, maybe?
You might just call that anti-slavery racism.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
just in connection to what we're talking about, maybe for you, I'm sure you've considered this in many dimensions, but like some of the most interesting parts of the book might be how they translate who Cugoano is addressing, who he sees as the proper object of anti-slavery appeal, Parliament, King. I know it changes over the course of the book, but I wonder if the translations on those points might be really interesting.
I'll look for that.
That's interesting. I haven't read Cugoano, so I have no idea myself. But
it's taught in social studies now.
yeah,
Take social studies 10.
I should. I wish I had time to take my colleagues' courses. Well, maybe on that note we will end, but thank you. This was absolutely riveting and fascinating. Thank you so much.